The Pulp Fiction era is like no other time in U.S. history. During the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and even into the early 60s, you could find these magazines, Pulp Fiction, at any newspaper stand. You could find them in most households, and everyone seemed to be reading them, from men to women to children. This particular genre or type of writing seemed to resonate with the whole nation. Everyone was reading these magazines. And these magazines, which were made from cheap paper, they were made from wood pulp, the cheapest type of paper that you could produce, which was very fragile. Well, let me tell you, these type of magazines covered every subject. If you wanted romance, you could find it. If you wanted detective stories or hard-boiled stories, you could find them. If you wanted westerns, if you wanted aviation, how about combat pilots flying all across the skies, or soldiers fighting diligently for our country? Or if you wanted to read about space travel, or fantasy, or science fiction, or pirates, or sea adventures. Maybe you wanted to read about prehistoric times with dinosaurs and cavemen and women. Or perhaps you wanted to travel to the center of the earth and be an adventurer or explorer. Whatever you wanted to read, there was an author out there who was willing to write these stories. And all for the cost of 1 penny per word. That's what they paid the authors. Not a lot of money, but you got your money's worth. These authors were invested in telling the best story possible. And they were pumping these stories out quickly as possible. Because for some of them, this was the only way that they could make a living. And they would write under different names, under different pseudonyms. And there's one particular author. His name is L. Ron Hubbard. He had 12 pen names. Can you believe that? 12. The Pulp Fiction magazine got its start in the early 1880s with the publication of the Golden Argosy, which featured steampunk types of stories. These stories evolved around the railroad and the Industrial Revolution. So this was an exciting time to be a writer. During the early 1800s, Edgar Rice Burroughs was considered one of the most successful American writers. Have you ever heard of him? Have you ever read any of his short stories or any of his short novels? Well, if you have, then you know that he is the writer and the creator of John Carter, who has many, many adventures. He travels to Mars, he falls in love with a princess, and he has lots of adventures. Edgar Rice Burroughs also is the creator of Tarzan. So as I said, he was truly popular and very successful during that time period. Science fiction and fantasy were also becoming quite popular. And these stories were becoming grittier, which reflected the changing time and attitude of the people. Then came the Roaring Twenties, and this is considered the golden age of pulp fiction. This was a time when soldiers were coming back from World War I, and they were trying to forget the war, and they needed ways to escape. And the country as a whole also was going through a lot and wanted to escape from the realities of life. So although everyone was reading these magazines, the main audience, the predominant audience, were men. And men in their 20s were reading science fiction, they were reading horror, they were reading space travel, and they were reading hard-boiled detective stories. And all of these stories were racier, they were grittier, they were more sensationalized, and the audience loved them. And during this time period, 2 particular magazines stand out and were considered outstanding. One was Weird Tales, which dealt with science fiction and horror, and the other was Amazing Stories. And these 2 magazines produced some of the greatest writers who have moved on to script novels, radio scripts, television scripts, so many types of writing. The comic books were also a part of this era of pulp fiction. and you could read Superman, you could read Batman, you could read a lot of these superheroes because they were also prevalent during this time. It is important to mention that Pulp Fiction did not only exist in mainstream society. If you were to look at some of the newspapers in the Black communities, you would find stories featuring characters and heroes in the Black community, and they would tackle subjects such as Jim Crow, segregation, social injustices. So there was Pulp Fiction in the African American community as well as in the mainstream. And a lot of these African American newspapers presented authors for the readers to follow and to enjoy their stories. Have you heard of the best-selling author Donald Goins? Have you read any of his works? Black Girl Lost, Kenyatta's Revenge, Swamp Man, Whoreson? His gritty tales could fall under the umbrella of Pulp Fiction as well as urban lit. And his books are gritty and startling and exciting and interesting and depressing and all those things mixed up in one. And you never know what you're going to get until you reach the end of his book. The writing stamina of these authors is incredible. Did you know that Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451 in 9 days and that he wrote it in the basement of a library? Are you aware that Harlan Ellison wrote 10,000 words in one night in order to meet a deadline? Are you aware that L. Ron Hubbard wrote over 1 million words in 1 year? These writers are just phenomenal, and their drive is encouraging and inspirational, and their need to create stories and to present them to the world is astounding. It is also important to mention that not every writer was successful, and that a lot of writers, when they were typing out their stories, they had their alcohol on the side and they would drink and write, drink and write, drink and write. And some of them never became successful. Some of them died in poverty. Some of them we will never know because they've disappeared from society. This is a sad truth about writing. All writers will not become successful. All writers will not be read by readers. Some writers will disappear into obscurity. And along with their disappearance, their beautiful words, their beautiful imagination, their beautiful creativity will vanish with them. Being a Pulp Fiction writer isn't easy. Some authors have lived in one-bedroom apartments that were infested with roaches. Some writers had to steal fruit in order to survive. Some writers would get paid a penny per word or a half a penny per word. But if you're lucky, you would get 2 pennies per word. But from what I understand, even though writing for these magazines isn't easy, it was fulfilling for a lot of the writers, and it allowed them to hone their craft, and it allowed them to learn how to write fast and how to write efficiently and how to meet deadlines and how to improve with each story that you write. The good thing about being a Pulp Fiction writer is that you are surrounded by your peers and you bounce ideas off of one another. And you are building a community of writers. And as you become successful, you will see your friends become successful. And you are there to encourage one another. And you understand the trials and the troubles and the tribulations of being a writer, of trying to survive off of a writer's salary. The last big hurrah for the Pulp Fiction magazines were the 1950s. During the end of that time period, the sales for those magazines declined and people's interest changed. People started watching television, started listening to radio programs, started watching movies. And so the appeal of the Pulp Fiction magazine started to disappear. But it is good to say that in later years, in the 1980s, there was a resurgence in the interest of Pulp Fiction. And some of the stories are being reprinted for a new generation.